a retired officer of the Camp Verde Police Department. I won't reveal my real name to the public out of fear that I'll be labeled a madman. For those who don't know me, you can call me Officer Crow. I began working in the force when I was fresh out of college. Over the years, I've dealt with every dangerous scenario possible. Robberies, domestic violence, gangs, you name it. I thought I'd seen it all until one night that would scar me for life in more ways than one. It was 1983, and I got a call about a possible home invasion. The resident was a woman who I'm going to call Jessica. Jessica was a 36-year-old nurse who just returned home from work. She was about to hit the sack when she heard something coming from the basement. The door was closed, so Jessica wasn't sure what she heard at first. She opened the door and heard multiple male voices laughing and chatting in the basement. Terrified, the nurse ran to her neighbor's house and called the police. My partner and I happened to be closest to Jessica's neighborhood. Let's call my partner Officer Williams. Williams and I pulled up to Jessica's house at around 10 p.m. The front door was left ajar when Jessica evacuated her house. With our guns drawn, Williams and I entered the estate. It was dead silent in there, even from the now open basement door. Regardless, Williams and I had to check the whole house before we could leave. Jessica's house was a typical 2-story suburban home, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom with a pool in the backyard. At some point during our search, I went down to the basement while Williams was still upstairs. I was beginning to think that the intruders left when I found something in the basement. There was a counter and some bar stools stacked up beside it. There was also a wooden door that was locked. It took a few seconds for me to figure out what I'd stumbled upon. When I was a kid, my grandpa would tell me stories about the Prohibition era. He even confided in me that he was a patron of some of the Speakeasy bars. Being in Arizona, I've stumbled upon a few of these places myself. Some of them still had alcohol hidden somewhere, so I presume that whatever was behind that door must have been that. I was searching for the key when Williams entered the basement. "Another speakeasy, huh?" he commented. "You think those guys were looking for some booze?" "It's possible," I replied. I found the key taped under the bar, but as soon as I removed it from its place, I heard what sounded like raspy breathing. I could tell by the look on my partner's face that he heard it too. We were the only 2 people in the abandoned speakeasy. Both of our flashlights were aimed at the locked door. I tried to refrain from shaking when I unlocked it. I was then about to turn the knob when I heard what I could only describe as something between a scream and a desperate gasp for air. I turned my flashlight to the source of the noise, which was in William's direction. A skinny humanoid grabbed him from behind as he made that cry. It bit down on my partner's jugular and pushed him to the ground before biting him again. The creature looked frail and dirty, as if it hadn't bathed or eaten in weeks. I shot at it once, but the bullet phased through him. I tried kicking at it, but my legs somehow went through him as well. When it was over, William's screams and struggling ceased. The humanoid stood up from my partner's body and turned to me. Blood covered the lower half of its face, and I could get a better look at it. It was wearing clothes covered in dust. I also saw a bullet hole on his forehead that I knew I had nothing to do with. I ran out of the basement when the creature made that horrible sound again. I could still hear it as I passed out at the front door. When I came to, I was in a hospital. The doctors explained that more units were sent to Jessica's house when Williams and I failed to return to the station. They found me passed out and Williams dead and called an ambulance. I didn't know what to tell my fellow cops when they asked me what had happened. No way they'd believe me if I said that some monster attacked Williams. So instead, I just said that some crazy guy ambushed him while we searched Jessica's house. I even told everyone that Williams went down to the basement before me. When other units investigated Jessica's house, they found out what was behind that door in the basement. It turned out that there was alcohol locked in that room, but that wasn't all. They also found a dead body lying on the crates of liquor. When Jessica was brought in for questioning, she told us everything she knew about the house. The nurse knew that the basement was a speakeasy when she moved in 3 days before the incident. She never went down to the basement, but as a history fan, she was compelled to look up the history of her home. The speakeasy was called Peter's Pub. Peter was an unemployed man who lived in Jessica's house during Prohibition. When he learned about speakeasies, he saw this as an opportunity to make money. Peter's Pub's patrons were limited to his neighbors, as they were the only people Peter could trust. But little did he know, one of his friends would turn on him. One neighbor of his was a member of one of the most feared mobs in Camp Verde. The rest of the story was revealed by a member who was caught by the police during that time. Once, Peter was unable to earn enough money to pay the mob. That's when he came up with an idea to be rid of them forever. One night, he invited the entire mob to his speakeasy for free drinks. At first, everyone was having a good time, but then some mobsters began to feel unwell. It only took one of them to stop breathing for everyone to understand what was going on. Peter poisoned all of the alcohol in his bar. The mob boss, who hadn't consumed enough poison yet, decided that he would punish Peter for his betrayal. The poor guy was shot, then tossed into the room with his poisoned goods. I saw the picture of Peter's remains, which looked exactly like the thing that killed Williams. After comparing the dates, I realized that the night Williams and I found Peter's Pub was the 50th anniversary of Peter's death. I began to put the pieces together and understood everything. Those voices Jessica heard were the souls of the mobsters who died down there. And that thing that consumed William's blood was his ghost craving one last drink. Hey buddy, get the hell off my lawn! This is what I heard before the punch of cold water against my face. I opened my eyes and found myself lying on the grass. I quickly sat up and saw an angry middle-aged man glaring at me. His hose was dripping from the nozzle after the spray while still being aimed at me. I looked around and realized that I was in a suburban neighborhood. "What are you, deaf?" the man demanded. "I said beat it!" He sprayed me again until a voice interrupted him. "Henry?" A woman around the man's age called out to him from the house behind us. "Henry, what's going on?" The man whom I'd gathered was Henry told her to go back inside. "This homeless bum is sleeping on our lawn, Maggie," he said. Maggie approached us while observing me. "Since when do homeless bums wear such nice suits?" she inquired. I looked down at my clothes and realized that I was wearing some formal attire. Henry noticed my clothing and agreed that it was strange. The only peculiar thing about my clothes was the handkerchief missing from my jacket's pocket. Maggie bent down to my level and asked for my name. I opened my mouth to answer her, but when I did so, nothing came to mind. I can't remember, I said. I can't remember anything. Henry and Maggie looked at each other in confusion and concern. Maggie then helped me up and ushered me to their car. As we drove off, Maggie said that she and Henry were taking me to the hospital. I didn't object, as I'd been feeling lightheaded since I woke up. Part of me also hoped that the doctors would help me regain my memories. On the way to the hospital, Maggie formally introduced herself and Henry to me. They'd been married for 16 years. Henry stepped out of the house that morning to get the mail when he found me lying unconscious on his front lawn. He explained that a homeless man passed out drunk in front of their house 3 weeks prior. When Henry found me, he thought I was another bum and wanted to get me away from his house as soon as possible. The doctor who examined me asked me a series of questions, but unfortunately, I couldn't recall anything. The last thing I remembered before Henry was fire and lots of screaming. There were no burns on my body. The only injury I had was a stitched-up stab wound on my back. The doctor deduced that the wound was about a month old. I was taken to a hospital room for for further examination. 5 minutes later, the police entered my room. It turned out that the hospital called them in hopes that my stab wound would help to identify me. Thankfully, the police knew who I was. My name is Drake Bluewood, and the stab wound was inflicted on me by my neighbor, William. According to the police, William lived in the apartment across from mine. I was in front of my apartment's door about to unlock it when William stabbed me from behind. Another neighbor from our floor heard my scream and tackled him while his roommate called 911. William claimed that I killed his brother Randy and wanted revenge. However, there was no evidence linking me to Randy's murder. William was charged with attempted murder and sent to jail. Even though the man tried to kill me, I felt sorry for him. The guy had to have been very close with his brother if he wanted to stab his killer. I asked the police if I could talk to William. I know how crazy my request may have sounded, but something told me that William could help me remember everything. For all we knew, I could remember something that would identify Randy's killer. The officers reluctantly agreed to my request. I was taken to the jail where William was held and came face to face with the man who hated me. He glared at me as I sat at the table before him. "You've got some nerve, Bluewood," William growled. "Unless you're here to confess, I suggest you get out of my sight." I explained my situation to William and asked him if he knew anything that was connected to his brother's death. I don't think he believed that I had amnesia. Regardless, he was willing to tell me everything he knew. Apparently, Randy was involved with a club in our city called the Claret Fellowship. It's a club dedicated to celebrating individualism and diversity. Randy and I were both members of the Claret Fellowship. In fact, it was I who convinced Randy to join that fellowship. For some reason, Randy wouldn't talk about the club even to his brother. He was found dead in his own house only 2 years after joining that very club. William blamed me for his brother's death because he often saw Randy and me together. The police didn't find any signs of a break-in. This indicated that Randy invited his killer inside because he knew him. Of course, none of this proved that I killed Randy. Although, I did find this information useful. I asked the police to take me to the Claret Fellowship's clubhouse. The police agreed and came with me. They suspected that whatever caused my amnesia may be the result of something bad. The Claret Fellowship's clubhouse is just like any other country club. I entered the club with a couple of officers. The receptionist gave me a friendly greeting and asked for a membership ID. One of the officers showed her his badge and asked to speak with a manager. The receptionist picked up the phone on her desk and told someone named Mr. Claret to come to the front desk. A well-dressed man in his 70s came to us. A small golden name tag that read Claudius Claret Jr. was attached to the jacket of his burgundy-colored suit. "Mr. Bluewood!" Mr. Claret hugged me as if we were old friends. "I'm glad to see that you're doing all right. Where on earth have you been?" I explained that I had amnesia and was wondering if Mr. Claret knew what had happened to me. Mr. Claret shrugged, saying he had no idea how I got amnesia. He then recounted what happened the last time he saw me. The Claret Fellowship was hosting a charity event the previous night. Mr. Claret and I were chatting when he suddenly excused himself to use the restroom. When he returned, I was nowhere to be found. Nobody noticed me leaving, and the clubhouse's CCTV system was acting up all day that day. Mr. Claret wanted to call the police when I failed to answer his calls, but he was sure that they wouldn't look into it and say that I just went home after drinking too much. But when Mr. Claret came to check on me the next morning, he learned from a neighbor that I never returned home. "How did you know Drake's home address?" one of the officers inquired. Mr. Claret told the police that he learned my address through the application I submitted for membership. He then offered the officers and me a tour of the club as an attempt to jog my memory. As we walked around the country club, I noticed a clearing with 3 evergreen trees. The evergreens were standing in a straight row. Mr. Claret noticed me gawking and asked what I was looking at. Feeling a little embarrassed, I told him that I was admiring the 3 trees in the clearing. "Oh, those?" Mr. Claret questioned. "Those have been there since before the country club was built. The Claret Fellowship was founded by Mr. Claret's father, Claudius Claret Sr. He was in the process of designing the club when he stumbled upon the evergreens. Claudius was amazed to see 3 evergreen trees standing in the middle of a clearing. Therefore, he found it would be better to leave them be. I approached the evergreens when a strange sensation washed over me. I saw the evergreens burning and a group of people standing before them. A hand was placed on my shoulder and the scene reverted to normal. An officer asked me if I was doing okay, as I seemed to be in a trance just then. I said I was fine, and we continued with the tour. I couldn't stop thinking about what I just saw. That vision was eerily similar to my earliest memory. Did I imagine all of that, or was that also a memory? I asked Mr. Claret if there was a fire last night. He was taken aback by my sudden query. Mr. Claret denied that there was ever a fire at the Claret Fellowship. The police backed him up, as 911 never received such a call. When I was looking around the country club, I couldn't see any burn damage. At the end of the tour, Mr. Claret asked me if I'd like to attend tomorrow's event. Not wanting to arouse suspicion, I accepted his invitation. When the police drove me to my apartment, I told them what I saw at the Evergreens. The officers suggested that I just hallucinated on account of my recovery. As plausible as it sounded at the time, part of me felt that it may have not been my imagination. The landlord gave me a new key, and I entered my apartment. That night, I took off my jacket and tossed it onto the floor, desperately wanting to sleep on the bed. When the jacket landed on the floor, something fell out of the pocket. I picked it up and saw that it was a small medallion. Engraved on the medallion was a cursive C and a star. When I saw the sigil, something awoke inside of me and I remembered everything. The Claret Fellowship wasn't the community it made itself to be. Some of the members weren't even human. They were actually monsters disguised as people. The thing is, not many people are accepting of monsters. I, on the other hand, always felt otherwise. I won't go into detail as to how I learned about the Fellowship. I don't want to risk the safety of my friends. I can, however, tell you what the Fellowship is really like. Yes, we do hold charity events. Any of the organizations we've donated to could tell you that. I would also like to tell you that the Claret Fellowship wasn't founded by Mr. Claret's father. In fact, that's the only part of the story that's false. The Claret Fellowship was founded by Mr. Claret himself. He's an immortal who founded the Fellowship many years ago. Mr. Claret was friendly with all the members, so much so that some of us have spent time with him outside the club. We even invite him to our homes sometimes. That's how Mr. Claret knew my address. Everything was great until the day I lost my memory. I was returning home from work when I heard William shouting from inside his apartment. I don't know why, but I decided to listen in. Most of the things he yelled were profanities, but I couldn't make out what he was shouting about. Somehow, he was convinced that the Claret Fellowship was to blame for his brother's murder. He was giving someone instructions on how to find me and where to take me. I couldn't hear any other voices, so William must have been talking on the phone. From what I've gathered, William was going to have me kidnapped and hold me prisoner until I told him everything I knew about the Claret Fellowship. Scared, I barricaded myself in my apartment and called Mr. Claret. After hearing my story, Mr. Claret asked me to meet him at the clubhouse. We met at the bar, and Mr. Claret showed me his grimoire. It had a spell that will give me amnesia at midnight. By then, I'd be heading home and the kidnappers would take me. That way, I have no chance of revealing sensitive information. That medallion in my jacket pocket was the key to get my memory back. Each member had a small medallion to symbolize their membership. The plan was to have the kidnappers take me with the medallion hidden in my pocket. Once they realized that they wouldn't get anything out of me, the kidnappers would let me go. Mr. Claret would then meet me the next evening and help me regain my memory. The medallion was enchanted to break the amnesia spell once I touched it. As for the missing handkerchief, it was used for the spell, because it required an item that belonged to me. When Mr. Claret asked me what I wanted to use, the handkerchief was the first thing that came to mind. That night at the charity event, I gave Mr. Claret my handkerchief for the spell. When it was over, I took off my medallion and stored it in my jacket pocket. I was just getting to my car when a burlap sack was suddenly placed over my head. William and his accomplices took me to an old barn that had been abandoned for years. By the time they threw me in there, the spell had gone into effect and I forgot everything. My kidnappers eventually released me, but not in the way Mr. Claret had hoped. The kidnappers knocked me out before disposing of my unconscious body, right onto Henry and Maggie's lawn. I guess they chose that neighborhood because it was on the opposite side of town. I know that by now, you're wondering why Mr. Claret and I did all of this instead of calling the authorities. Yes, that would have been a quicker, if not better, solution. However, that would only risk exposing the Claret Fellowship's secret to the world. For example, the police could find the application forms and notice that they asked the applicant's species. No way can the Fellowship trust the cops with confidentiality. By now, the Claret Fellowship has been relocated with a new name. Even us members have changed our identities. I don't know what happened to Randy. I'm not even sure what triggered those visions of flames and screams. In any case, I sincerely hope that the police find the ones responsible for his demise. Maybe there will come a day where the Claret Fellowship can reveal itself. But until then, you must remain behind the facade of your average country club. When I moved into my own house, one of the first things I bought for it was a noise machine. My current job is pretty stressful, and I needed all the rest I could get. I purchased my noise machine online, along with my other appliances. Unfortunately, the nearby stores didn't have any, and I didn't have the time to drive anywhere that day. I don't remember who, but someone was selling their noise machine on Etsy. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but there were some oddities that I noticed almost immediately. The first thing I noticed was the noise machine's appearance. Most of the ones I've seen were either round or in polygonal shapes. This one, however, was shaped like a star. Not only that, but I couldn't find the company's logo anywhere on the device. At the time, I didn't see anything wrong with those things. I'd convinced myself that the noise machine was shaped like that for originality, hence the lack of branding. Plus, the product itself had good reviews. The noise machine was delivered to my house in less than a week. The first few nights were great. I woke up every morning feeling rested, but one night, something weird happened with my noise machine. I'd played the ocean waves setting when I noticed something off. At first, it sounded like faint interference, but when I listened closely, I realized that it sounded like footsteps in the sand. I concluded that I didn't notice this before because of the overlapping sounds of the ocean waves. Over time, the footsteps seemed to have gotten louder each time I played the same setting. The final straw occurred when the sound of a woman humming was suddenly added to the waves and footsteps. I was so freaked out that I decided to contact the company first thing in the morning. Since I couldn't recall the company's name, I looked up the web page where I purchased the noise machine on my internet history. But when I clicked on the link, I was greeted with a 404 error. I even Googled the star-shaped noise machine and still couldn't find the company. My only option then was to trash the noise machine and get a new one. My new one took longer to arrive than the first one, but I didn't care. I tested the noise machine as soon as I got it. I tried every setting and haven't heard anything out of the ordinary. I was sleeping with my new noise machine on when I had a weird dream. I was at a beach at night. I then heard a familiar humming from a distance. I turned around and saw a figure in the distance. The humming grew louder as the figure walked closer. It was a barefoot woman in a tattered black dress. Her eyes were red with no irises or pupils. She had scratches all over her corpse-like skin and a menacing smile. The woman stretched her arm towards me as her eyes glowed brighter. I couldn't get away, as if my feet were stuck in the sand. I woke up when the woman's hand was mere centimeters away from my face. I've had my share of nightmares, but they never scared me to the point of sweating in fear. Due to recent events, I highly doubt that it was just a bad dream. I stopped using noise machines after that and never saw the humming woman again. Whatever curse my first noise machine had must have affected the last one too. I never figured out who that woman was or where my first noise machine came from. If you're looking for a noise machine, never get the star-shaped ones. My friends and I had been planning this camping trip for weeks. There's a beautiful forest in Wyoming that the students of my college visit every summer. This year, it was my friend group's turn to camp there. It was June, and my friends and I were getting ready for our trip. My group consisted of 6 people: Lucas, John, Cass, Cole, Paige, and myself. The forest is called Dusty Willow Grove. It's famous for the same reason the students of my college go there. The forest was part of the Pony Express Trail. However, that's not the sole reason behind its popularity. In the winter of 1860, a man named Gordon Bentley was riding through those woods. He joined the Pony Express so that he could support his recently widowed mother. Unfortunately, Gordon never made it to San Francisco. When the authorities started looking for him, all they found was his hat near a lake. That lake was in Dusty Willow Grove. No one knows what happened to Gordon or his horse. If you're in Dusty Willow Grove at night, you can hear the sound of a horse galloping through the woods. Those who believe in ghosts say it's the spirit of Gordon Bentley. My friends and I never believed in that stuff. We just wanted to unwind after a grueling semester. Anyway, my friends and I left for Dusty Willow Grove. Paige drove us to our camping spot in the forest, which was very close to where the Pony Express Trail was. After setting up our camp, we celebrated the beginning of summer with some beer. We were 19 each at the time, but hey, some people do wild things, even in college. It was getting dark, and my friends and I were waiting for the Gallops. But after a few hours, we got bored and decided to go to sleep. I don't know what time this happened, but I suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. I must have drunk more than I thought because I needed to pee. I'm one of those people who can't urinate when someone's watching. So to avoid getting caught, I walked away from the camp until it was out of sight. I stopped at some bushes next to a lake. I just pulled my shorts up when I heard something. I moved my flashlight around until I saw something heading towards me. It was a man riding a horse. I called out to the guy, but he didn't react to me. The rider was wearing old-fashioned clothing, and both he and his horse were covered in snow. He was squinting his eyes and looking around as if he had difficulty seeing. I was perplexed. How could someone be covered in snow in the summer? The man was riding his horse towards the lake, and I tried to stop him. But when I touched his leg, my hand phased through him. The horse stepped onto the water and continued walking as if it were land. The steed walked on the surface until it suddenly stopped. I then heard what sounded like ice breaking before the horse and rider suddenly fell into the water. The man's hat flew off its head before landing on the ground near the lake. I just stood there, trying to process what had just happened, and when it finally hit me, I screamed. My friends heard me and ran to me as fast as they could. When they asked me what happened, I told them everything. When I pointed at the rider's hat, it was gone. My friends thought that the alcohol was making me see things and escorted me back to our camp. When the camping trip was over and we headed back to our respective homes, I finally figured out what happened that night. The snow-covered man I saw was Gordon Bentley's ghost. I've heard of spirits of the deceased who repeat their final moments alive. What I saw that night must have been how Gordon died. I emailed my history professor and told him my story and my theory. When the professor emailed me back, he told me something that further confirmed my suspicions. It turned out that during Gordon's trip to San Francisco, Dusty Willow Grove was hit by a blizzard one night. This had to have been around the time Gordon reached that forest. The heavy snowfall must have made it difficult for him to navigate, and based on what I've seen, Gordon accidentally steered his horse to the then frozen lake. The ice then broke, and both died in the freezing water. I told my friends and classmates about the lake and how Gordon Bentley died. I don't know who, but one of my classmates was friends with a police officer. When they heard my story, they'd asked said officer to investigate the lake. The police had someone dive into that lake, and, sure enough, they found the skeletal remains of a man and a horse. Gordon and his horse's remains were recovered and given proper burials. It's been a year since then, and the Gallops were never heard again. Not everyone believed me when I said that I saw Gordon Bentley's ghost, but at least I can take comfort in knowing that he's reunited with his mother. I go on long walks in the park every Saturday. It was close to my neighborhood and relatively quiet in the evenings. I put on my earbuds and listen to my favorite music when I go on my walks. It helps me clear my head after a long week of work. I live in a small town where not much happens. The people here are friendly and everyone knows each other. That's what I thought until the night that changed my view forever. One evening, I was so deep in thought that I'd strayed from my usual path. I was about to turn back when I saw something near the tallest evergreen I've ever seen. A little girl, who looked to be 6 or 7 years old, was looking up at the tree. She wore a pink dress and had her blonde hair tied in 2 braids. I looked around for anyone who could be watching the kid. That's when I realized that we were all alone. I turned back to the girl to ask her where her parents were, but she was gone. I figured that the girl went back home while I was looking for her parents. I visited my friend Jared the next day. While we were chatting, I told him about the little girl I met at the park. He went pale when I mentioned her. I asked what was wrong, and Jared said to me that he'd met the same kid. He was walking his Rottweiler Storm in the same park when the dog suddenly tried pulling away from him. Storm was barking while keeping his eyes in a specific direction. When Jared looked the same way, he saw a little girl looking up at an evergreen tree. Worried about the unsupervised child, he decided to approach her. Meanwhile, Jared was trying to calm his dog down so as to not scare the child. Storm stopped barking when he and Jared were a few feet away from her. Jared asked the girl if she was okay and where her parents were. All she did was ask where Johnny was while keeping her eyes on the tree. Jared was about to ask who Johnny was when the girl did something he'd never anticipated. The kid's head turned 180 degrees like that girl from The Exorcist. Her face was bloody with a large gash on her forehead. With a sorrowful expression on her face, The little girl asked the same question. Jared screamed as he and Storm ran away. This happened around the same time of day I saw that kid. Jared always believed in ghosts and was very familiar with the town's ghost stories. The one about the bloody child was one of the most infamous tales. The girl's name was Felicia. In 1942, Felicia went to the park with her older brother, John. Felicia was 6 and John was 10. Ever since their father went to war, John had to help with looking after his sister. This irritated the boy, as he didn't get to play with his friends anymore. John's resentment towards Felicia grew over time. This went on for weeks until the day tragedy struck the small family. Felicia went to the park with John when they came across the tallest evergreen in the park. The little girl always wanted to climb a tree, so she asked John if she could. John agreed, not thinking about the consequences that would follow. Felicia started climbing the tree when John saw his classmates playing. Thinking that his sister would be fine, John decided to finally spend some time with his friends. No more than 5 minutes passed when the boy's actions caught up with him. Felicia was trying to pull herself up onto a branch when it suddenly broke. Felicia landed face down, hitting her head against a rock. The poor girl passed away before anyone could help her. It's unknown what became of the family after that. They moved away almost immediately after the war. John admitted to the authorities that he was to blame for his little sister's death. The guilt was so bad that he couldn't bring himself to leave the house. Since then, Felicia's spirit appeared at the tree every evening, waiting for her brother. Does anyone remember Trollz? Not the movies with Poppy and Branch, but that TV show from 2005. Like the movie, the show was based on the Troll dolls. Trollz was a TV show that came out in October of 2005 and ended about a month later. Its main characters were female trolls named Amethyst, Ruby, Sapphire, Topaz, and Onyx. They went on mystical journeys and overcame difficult situations with their magic and friendship. Their source of magic was the gems on their stomachs. The show may have seemed harmless with its intent of teaching the value of friendship. However, there's a dark truth behind Trollz. The show's protagonists were based on real girls who practiced magic. No, they weren't part of a satanic cult, but rather, the girls formed a secret coven amongst themselves. Their names were Vicky Ware, Diane Shaw, Leanne Martin, Kathy Raymond, and Joanne Cook. All 5 of them lived in a quiet town in the state of Washington. It all started when Vicky began to feel insecure about her place in life. Vicky grew up being raised by her mother and grandmother. She was taught to be polite and passive. Even if she were offended, Vicky wasn't allowed to argue. This, in turn, made her into a doormat. Even Vicky's friends often gave her the short end of the stick without knowing how it affected her. This part of the story is what inspired the first episode of Trollz. Diane was born into the wealthiest family in her town. She was entitled and obsessed with her looks. Her parents allowed her to use the family fortune to keep up with the latest trends. The one thing Diane's parents wouldn't let her do was date whoever she wanted. She couldn't even flirt with a boy without being reprimanded afterward. Diane's parents didn't want her to start dating until she turned 18. They also forbade Diane from dating anyone who wasn't upper class like them. Lillian was an intelligent student and the best in her class. However, not many people appreciated her gift. The adults often told Lillian that a woman would never be successful in life. Some of her teachers even gave her grades that were worse than she deserved. When Lillian asked them about it, they'd say that girls don't get straight A's. Lillian dreamed of one day becoming a professor at Harvard, but with the way things were going, it seemed less likely that she would even enroll there. Kathy's parents left her at an orphanage when she was just a baby. While living in the orphanage, Kathy dreamed of designing a line of fashion. Every time she went to school, Kathy would watch her classmates and envy. It bothered her that they got to wear nice clothes while she wore old hand-me-downs. Kathy wasn't the brightest student either. She didn't understand a lot and was made fun of for it. There were also times when Kathy was caught drawing outfits instead of doing her schoolwork. Joanne was possibly the boldest in the friend group. Like Vicky's family, Joanne's parents tried to teach her how to stay silent. However, Joanne wasn't so compliant. She never hesitated to stand up for herself when someone insulted her. Her parents were often angry with her and punished Joanne for her disrespect. Once, her parents locked her in her room for 3 days as punishment for talking back to a bully. Growing up in oppressive environments was what forged the friendship between the 5 girls. In 1963, the girls entered high school. It was around this time when Vicky's troubles began. During her summer vacation, Vicky learned about witchcraft and how it empowers people. All their lives, Vicky and her friends were forced to conform to the ludicrous standards of their town. Thinking that this was what they needed, Vicky told her friends about witchcraft. At first, none of the girls were too sure about the idea, but after some convincing, Vicky's friends finally agreed. One Saturday night, the girls gathered in a clearing outside of town. They told their respective parents and guardians that they were going to have a sleepover at a classmate's house. Vicky approached her friends with a spell book she purchased from local witches. One of its spells was a ritual for summoning an entity called Nomus. According to the witches, Nomus granted power and wealth to those who summoned him. The ceremony required a doll with the spellcaster's birthstone attached to it. Since troll dolls had small gems on their stomachs, the girls decided to use those. During the ritual, each girl held a doll with their corresponding birthstones. Vicky's birthstone was the amethyst, Diane's was the ruby, Lillian's was the sapphire, Kathy's was the topaz, and Joanne's was the onyx. On that clearing, the girls summoned Nomus. However, the ritual failed and they were never heard from again. What happened was that Vicky overlooked an important rule in the spell. The spellcaster had to use real gems, but instead, Vicky and her friends used the plastic replicas on their troll dolls. If you use fake gems to summon Nomus, he will be insulted and drag you down to his dark realm. It wasn't Vicky's fault that she made that mistake. The spellbook was ancient, written long before we had the technology to produce plastic gems. It never would have occurred to the author to be so specific. Even the witches who sold the spellbook to Vicky didn't think to warn her. When the witches learned what happened, they shared the story with other magic users to prevent others from making the same mistake. Somehow, the future producers of Trollz caught wind of the tragedy. They were so touched by the strong friendship between the lost girls that they decided to make a show about it. Not only did it mirror the friendship between Vicky and her friends, but their troll counterparts were also given everything they wanted in life. Vicky had the mutual respect of her peers. Diane was free to date whoever she wanted. Lillian was appreciated for her intelligence. Kathy got to own fashionable attire. And Joanne could speak her mind without repercussions. Nomus also got his own character, a reoccurring villain named Simon. Yes, the name of Nomus's troll's counterpart was his own name spelled backward. The story of Vicky and her friends may not have a happy ending, but at least it inspired the importance of true friendship. Are you familiar with the constellations? For those who don't know, they're groups of stars that make up images based on myths and legends. Each constellation is based on Greek mythology. For centuries, humanity has familiarized itself with these imaginary pictures. As an astronomer, I know them all by heart. But one day, I discovered something I never thought I'd find. I found a long-forgotten constellation. It all started when I was on vacation in Athens. I was exploring an old temple and found an inscription on one of the walls. I studied Greek when I was in college, so I was able to translate. The inscription read, "Praise Morpheus, god of pain and madness." I was beyond confused. I've studied Greek mythology and am very familiar with the pantheon. However, I've never heard of Morpheus. The temple was invaded by the Romans centuries ago, so I assumed that the information about Morpheus was destroyed or lost in the chaos. As I searched the ruined temple, I found a star map on a table. I studied the map, admiring its ancient design, when I noticed something off. As an astronomer, I have every constellation and their positions memorized. But there's one more that isn't on any of the star maps I've seen. There's a constellation with the name Morpheus written next to it. What made this constellation unique from all the others was how the stars were positioned. Constellations typically consist of quad shapes and straight lines. The Morpheus constellation, however, is 12 stars in a perfect circle. When I explored the rest of the temple, I found something else. There was an ivory statue of a man with a small fire pit in front of it. He had swords driven through his head, shoulders, and torso. I guessed that this was a depiction of Morpheus. I then noticed where the blades entered his body and understood the constellation's star formation. The stars represent the opposite ends of the swords in Morpheus's body. After doing some more digging, I learned the whole story of this entity. Morpheus was a god that enjoyed making humans suffer both physically and psychologically. Those who worshipped him willingly subjected themselves to torture. They then used their god's power to punish their enemies. Basically, Morpheus's followers were all masochists. The disciples believed that by torturing themselves before Morpheus's image, he'd grant them his power. One example of the cult's extremity was the fire pit in front of the statue. If a cultist needs Morpheus's powers, they'd have to prove their worth by holding hot coal. The amount of time the cultists lasted would match the amount of time they'd have said powers. The one thing I couldn't figure out was why this information wasn't made public. Anyone could have excavated this temple and found all of this as I did. But for some reason, this place was abandoned the day it was attacked. I knew a humanities professor named Professor Hall and decided to tell him about Morpheus and his temple. I emailed him everything I've learned about the god, as well as some pictures I've taken in the temple. Professor Hall agreed that it was strange that nobody retrieved this information before. He asked me to look for more facts about Morpheus. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anything outside the temple. Even Google didn't have any results. Before my search, I assumed that the star map and other artifacts were kept in the temple for the sake of preservation. But after seeing the expressions of the locals I've questioned, I realized that there's more to this than I thought. For example, when I asked a librarian for books about Morpheus, she looked at me as if I were the most horrifying thing she'd ever seen. She even pretended not to understand English, even though she greeted me in that language when I'd approached her prior. That evening, I was heading back to the hotel I was staying in when someone stopped me. A woman wearing a hoodie came to me with a satchel. She heard that I was looking for information on Morpheus. The stranger handed me her bag. saying that everything I needed to know was in there. I opened it and saw a few scrolls, a dagger, and a small figurine of Morpheus. I looked up to thank the woman, but she was gone. When I got back to my hotel room, I dumped all of the satchel's contents onto my bed. I then proceeded to read the first scroll. A sketch of the Morpheus constellation was drawn above some Greek writing. Based on my translations, this scroll spoke of a religious holiday that celebrated Morpheus. It lasted for 6 days, each with its own tradition that only happened at night. The holiday was called Philoponos. On the first night, Morpheus' cult members stood in a circle and held hands while inviting their god to Earth. After said prayer, the high priest or priestess would ask the cult for a willing doorway. The member had to offer him or herself willingly. Once a volunteer was chosen, they're chained at the altar and had a sword driven through them. Morpheus then entered Earth to join his cult for Philoponos. For each night, a blade was pushed through the sacrifice until it looks like the Morpheus constellation. When the last sword was added on the final night, Morpheus returned to the underworld. I don't want to go into the details of what the traditions entailed, as I feel sick just thinking about them. Let's just say that each night involved someone getting tortured, each night with a different method. I didn't get any sleep that night. When I closed my eyes, I could see the bloodshed that transpired on Philoponos. Everything was so real that it couldn't have been a dream. It was so bad that I woke up throwing up on the floor beside my bed. I returned to America and showed my friend the satchel and its contents. Professor Hall was fascinated by Morpheus and his cult. I understand that learning something new in history is excellent for a humanities professor, but this cult was deranged as it was disgusting. Then again, my friend always had a strange infatuation with the bloodiest of historical events. I returned to my regular daily routine after that. I thought that I could finally sleep without having to think of the wretched cult or their god again. But instead, I faced something else that deprived me of peace of mind. About a few months had passed, and I'd forgotten about Morpheus. But early one morning, I woke up to a phone call from one of my colleagues. Before I could say anything, he told me to turn on the news. I could tell by how he sounded that this was serious. So I turned on the TV and was appalled by what I saw. The headline read, "Professor Murders 7. My heart sank when I saw Professor Hall being pushed into a police car. As I watched the news bulletin, I learned that Professor Hall had reenacted Philoponos. The victims were professors of the same field. Professor Hall invited them to his home under the pretense of studying Morpheus. This was a week before his arrest. Suddenly, I remembered the dates of Philoponos. I compared the day those professors came to Professor Hall's house to the first night of the holiday. Sure enough, it was the same as the first night of Philoponos. My heart broke when the news said that Professor Hall was going to receive a life sentence. I visited him the first chance I got. When I asked Professor Hall why he did all of this, he told me something disturbing. He claimed that Morpheus told him to do the rituals. My friend explained that while he was reading my written translations, he heard Morpheus' voice. According to my friend, Morpheus wanted someone to revive his holiday traditions. He then confessed to the real reason why he did all of this. About 2 years prior, a student from Professor Hall's university named David went missing. Professor Darwin, another teacher from the same university, claimed that Professor Hall was responsible. David was Professor Hall's worst student from that semester. He never paid attention in class or did a single assignment. Professor Darwin knew this because he overheard Professor Hall complaining to his sister about David over the phone. This convinced Professor Darwin that my friend did something to his student. Professor Darwin even went as far as to have his accusation told on the news. Professor Darwin was the kind of person who viewed everything as a competition. So many times, he tried to prove that he's better in humanities than Professor Hall. The police never convicted Professor Hall due to a lack of evidence. I'm not sure if Professor Darwin truly believed that Professor Hall was guilty. Regardless, the situation deeply affected the reputations of both my friend and the university. Professor Hall never got over what Professor Darwin did to him. So when Morpheus contacted him, Professor Hall saw Philippanos as an opportunity to get his revenge. This was the last time I ever spoke to Professor Hall. He disappeared from his cell the following day, and a week later, Professor Darwin's mangled corpse was found in his house. I don't know where Professor Hall is. What I do know is that Morpheus is real as he is dangerous. Only now do I understand why the temple kept its secrets. I hope that nobody ever follows the traditions of Philippanos again. I moved to a new town last summer after receiving a promotion at work. I was sad to move away from my hometown, but it wasn't so bad, seeing as we live in the age of Skype. I had my stuff moved in the middle of the day. Of course, everyone was at work or school, so I didn't get to meet any of my neighbors. It was around 6 o'clock, and I was making dinner when I noticed something out the window. 3 women were standing on the sidewalk and talking to each other. I couldn't make out what the women were saying through the closed window. They then walked to my front door, and I heard the doorbell ring. I opened the door and saw the women before me. They looked worried for some reason. The women introduced themselves as my neighbors, Kylie, Hannah, and Melanie. I asked them if they'd like to come inside out of common courtesy. All 3 women flatly declined. Kylie asked me why I bought this house. I told my neighbors about my promotion and how I wanted to go with the cheapest option. As I did so, I noticed Melanie's body language. Her eyes scanned every inch of my house as her body quivered. I asked Melanie if she was okay while following her eyesight. "She's fine, Jill," Hannah answered for her friend while holding her hand. Kylie then said that it was nice to meet me before escorting Melanie away with Hannah. The way she looked and sounded indicated that she wanted to get her friend away as soon as possible. I stood there, utterly dumbfounded by my neighbor's antics. I returned to my meal, trying to forget about the weird interaction. When I woke up the following day, I was met with a startling surprise. Red footprints were all over the living room floor. From the size of the feet, I could tell that they belonged to a child no older than 10. As I observed the bizarre scene, I saw that the basement door was wide open. I also determined that someone came out of the basement, walked around the room, then returned to the basement. The first thing I could think of doing was investigating the basement. The basement was pretty small, with a single light bulb dangling in the center of the room. It didn't take long for me to search the place before confirming that nobody was there. There was a window, but it was too narrow for anyone to climb through. What was even stranger was that there were no footprints down there. I didn't know what to make of any of this. I couldn't even tell what substance the footprints were made of or locate the source. It couldn't have been blood. If that were the case, then whose was it? I cleaned the footprints as I didn't know what else to do. I didn't call the police as I found it unnecessary. There was no body, nor was anything stolen, so I just left it alone. The following day, I found the same mess in my living room. My mouth fell open as I tried to comprehend how this happened. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to clean as I had to go to work. I returned home after work and saw someone looking through my living room window. It was Melanie. She had that same fearful expression as the night before. I asked her what she was doing. Melanie mumbled something incoherent in response, still looking through my window. I got closer, asking her what she said. "Andy's still here," Melanie replied. I could see her eyes well up as she said that name. Confused, I asked Melanie who Andy was. She finally turned to me, wiping her tears. Melanie explained that Andy was a boy who lived in my house before I did. I came to know that Andy was Melanie's childhood friend. He was a sweet boy, loved by everyone, but his life wasn't all perfect. Cecile, Andy's dad, was always cold towards him. For some reason, the man suspected that Andy wasn't his biological kid. Cecile had marital problems with his wife, Veronica, which started about 2 years before Andy's birth. The conflict went on for months, until the day Veronica discovered that she was pregnant. Cecile seemed happy when he first heard the news. Veronica and the neighbors thought that parenthood would fix everything. Sadly, things didn't work out as everyone hoped. Throughout the pregnancy, Cecile was oddly quiet. People have even caught him staring at his wife whenever they went out. It wasn't until after Andy was born that everyone knew why. It started with Cecile staring at Andy like he did Veronica. One night, Cecile went to a bar with his colleagues. In his drunken state, the man said that he didn't think Andy was his. Cecile's colleagues just laughed, chalking it up to alcohol-induced nonsense. When she was 8, Melanie and her mom went to Andy's house for a playdate. Melanie's mom knocked on the door, but no one answered. Finally, after waiting a couple of minutes, Melanie and her mom decided to look through the window. Both were mortified by what they'd witnessed. Cecile tossed Andy's bloody body into the basement. Melanie screamed as her mother picked her up and ran back into the car. Melanie was crying the whole trip to the police station. When the police barged into Andy's house, they found Cecile on his knees in front of the basement stairs. Blood was splattered all over the living room. Cecile confessed to killing his family and throwing their corpses into the basement. Before Melanie and her mom arrived for the playdate, Cecile confronted Veronica. He demanded to know who she cheated on him with, as he was sure that Andy wasn't his. Veronica swore up and down that she never cheated on Cecile. Cecile was so mad at his dishonest wife that he killed her and Andy in a fit of rage. It wasn't until after the deed was done that Cecile snapped out of it. He regretted his actions and cursed himself for his insecurities. Melanie never recovered from the trauma of that incident. She couldn't even bring herself to Andy's house without being reminded of the poor kid's demise. Since that day, Andy's spirit roamed the house every night, leaving bloody footprints behind. I'm planning to move soon. Only this time, I'll be checking the history of the openings beforehand.